Good evening. Before we start, we got an announcement that after we're done, we'll have a brief meeting where all of those men who are happily volunteering or being volunteered by their spouse to serve at the Ladies' Day that is coming up in just under 2 weeks now. Just a meeting explaining exactly what will be needed of us. So we'll have that again right after. It shouldn't take but a few minutes. So tonight we are taking a look at I guess it's sort of a question, but it's a topic that we have a decent understanding of, or maybe a vague conception of, but we could always dig deeper into. And there's a purpose to what we're going to do, which is to show that as bad as things might be today, and when we look around in our society and we see all the evils going on, it's a reminder that this isn't the first time that's happened. And so tonight what we're going to look at is, I guess, answering the question, how bad was it in the time of Christ, or around the time that God decided to bring His church into the world and decided to send His Son into the world? And specifically, we're looking at Roman culture because it was the predominant culture of the time. So how bad was Rome? And we're going to try to answer that question. The text that was read for us gives us a pretty good hint, though. When Paul writes this letter to the Romans, he's not talking in vague terms of what some Gentiles out there are like, but instead he's talking about the people that they live in the same city with, the people who are the elite, who are doing a lot of the most evil actions themselves during this time. But obviously, he's condemning all of that as he writes in Romans chapter 1 here. But what we're going to do is take a look at a few different categories of the wickedness of what was going on at the time, and we'll get into some uncomfortable detail on some of it, because again, it's a reminder to us that maybe things aren't quite as bad as we seem to think they are today. But let's start out with the social norms in Roman culture, especially the social classes. In Rome and in the Roman Empire as a whole, this would be at the time of Christ, this would be a little bit before Christ, this would be for a few hundred years after Christ was on the earth, there was a very strict class system, meaning that there were a few very wealthy people that ruled everything, and then there was everybody else. And if you were among those who were the elite, then you could do pretty much whatever you wanted. And because you were both a Roman citizen and because you were well-to-do or you were connected with the right people, you could do things that nobody else could. And that could be in the positive sense, in that you could hold a political office, but a commoner could not. You could hold a position later on in the Christian church even, where the commoner could not, but you could also hold a religious office in pagan terms as well. You could be a general in the army, but nobody else could, but that was a spot reserved for you. And you could own land, and most commoners did not own land, although some would. And you were allowed to marry other people within your class, but you could not marry lower, and no one that was lower could marry up. Now, throughout this lesson, we'll see similarities to what we have today, but all of it's going to be to an extreme. And so today, while we may have a little bit of a class system as far as financially, or as far as finances go, we talk about upper class or middle class. In this case, there is no such thing as upward mobility. There is no such thing as somebody making it to the top. That just doesn't happen, because you're either born into it or you are not. And that will never change in Roman society. Now, of course, another thing that won't change is if you are born female. And if you're a woman in Roman society, you of course do not have the right to vote. It's just not there, and it won't ever be there. And even if you are among the elite, you still don't have the right to vote. You're not going to be holding political or religious offices, and you are going to be under the control of your father initially, and then you'll be under the control of your husband. And that's how life is going to operate. And that's if you're in the elite class. Now, if you are instead a commoner, then you might not even have the basic benefits of even those who are a little bit wealthier. The other category of people is not just those who are commoners, but those who are slaves. Now, in Roman times, slavery was a massive money-making business, among other things, but it was also the product of war. And so most of the slaves in Roman society were prisoners of war, essentially, but permanently. They were never going to go back home. They had been captured, their territory had been taken by the Romans, now they are a slave. Sometimes you could be poor enough that you would just end up being sold into slavery, essentially, but most of them were foreign in some way, and they were bought and sold as property. In fact, there is a phrase, a Latin phrase, obviously, which I'll have to read off, that says, servus non habet personam. What does that mean? It means slaves have no personhood. It means a slave in Roman society is not a person. They are a piece of property, and you can do with them what you want. And that's quite literal. You can do anything you want. And so slaves under the Roman system could be punished quite viciously for anything that they did or that they didn't do. It really didn't matter because they were your property, and you can treat them how you want to. They could be forced into prostitution, and that was fine. That was legal because they were your property, and if that's how you wanted to make money, so be it. So again, no rights were there. They could be sent to the mines to work if they were particularly bad. They could be killed for just about any reason, and it would still be okay. If they ran away, obviously you could kill them if you found them again, but if they ran away, sometimes they would be forced to wear collars, kind of like we put on animals, that would have a return address. And it would say, if you find this person, then bring them back to wherever it is that they're from. And these, of course, were not nice, comfortable things to wear, but instead were iron shackles, and they would be permanently put on the people. If you ran away, you could also be branded a fugitive, and so the letters for the Roman word fugitive would be branded on your forehead because you're a runaway. And from that point on in your life, that's it. That's who you are, and people know to look out for you because you're only trouble. And all of those are really more personal terms than they would have used, again, because these people were considered to be property and nothing else. There's also some examples in history, or the history of the Romans, where a slave would kill their master. And when that happened, the punishment very often was that every slave of the household would be killed. Not just the one who had committed the murder, all of them. And so it could be that one slave has killed his master and 200 slaves died. And what's that to them? Because again, these people are not anything but property. And so they don't have any of the ideas that we have. And yes, we had slavery in this country. And yes, there's a lot of similarities even. But we have moved beyond that point. But that was a permanent fixture in Rome. And so when we look at the Roman society, the structure of their society was fundamentally less fair, less just, and less balanced than ours is today. And it wasn't really going to ever change. And so we look at our society today and we say, well, things aren't great and there is inequality. How does it compare to what we see in the ancient world? Well, there is a fair bit of difference. Let's move on from that idea, though, of just the society, and talk about the sexual side of things. Now, this also is uncomfortable, but we're going to talk about it because it shows a similarity to today, but again, the extremes that we don't necessarily find today. First thing is this, that again, males, especially those who were of the elite class, could do whatever they wanted. And that is extraordinarily literal in this sense. And so men were largely permitted to have sexual relations with anyone they wished because that's just how their society operated, and that was okay in their mind. So, of course, concubines were common, as in someone that you're not married to, that's kind of a mistress, as we might think of today. And that almost seems tame compared to the rest, because beyond just concubines, pedophilia was perfectly acceptable. There were no laws against it. It was not a problem because so long as you were in a position to perform those acts, you were welcome to. Is that what we see today? Not really, and we would cringe at the very idea, and yet there's no laws against it. Why? Because that's just how they operate, and that we probably fail to understand some of this because we've lived all the time in a Bible-based society, or at least with Western moral values. That's not what this was founded on. This doesn't exist. And so there is no idea that there is this kind of sin that will be punishable by a God. At least not this kind of sin. Same thing's true for homosexuality. Although it's not quite like today, it wasn't so much based on attraction, same-sex attraction. What we're talking about here is, again, the same thing. If you are in a position to choose to perform any kind of homosexual behavior, great. You are more than welcome to do that under Roman society. And it happened quite often. And again, it's almost a form of dominance. It would happen primarily, well, not primarily, it could be anyone. It could be minors, it could be slaves, it could be prostitutes, it does not matter. And so in all of these cases, people could do exactly what they wanted to. Transgenderism is probably something we think of as a modern invention, and yet it really isn't. Now, when we're talking about it in Roman society, there's a couple of problems. One, people have gone back and revised what transgenderism looked like in Rome, almost to glorify it, to try to prove a point today, to say, well, if it existed in the ancient world, then we can do that today. Well, not so much, but that is an attempt that's being made. But still, cross-dressing was quite common in Rome. It was not seen as any kind of problem. And beyond that, there are some historical examples of attempted sex changes, even back then. Now, I can't imagine that went very well for anyone that happened to, but those ideas, they existed, and they weren't condemned. Even in our society, it's probably still frowned upon more than it was at that time. Now, with all of this, what we're really doing is just explaining what Paul meant. Paul kind of glosses over it, but when we read verse 28 of Romans chapter 1, it says, "And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting." They decided in their society these things were okay. They decided that there was no problem with any of the things that we understand to be every possible sexual sin out there. And they said, no, we're good with that. And God said, okay, if that's what you're going to do, then that's what you're going to do. He gave them over to this, to the point where they were able to just continually grow more and more corrupt in the things that they were doing. The other category that we'll talk about is probably the one that Romans are maybe best known for, which is violence. And so when you think of Roman society, there's probably one thing that stands out maybe more than any other, especially when it comes to violence, which is gladiatorial matches. Now, those did exist, and I think to some degree they've probably been idealized, romanticized a little bit, even to the point of having movies about it today. But in reality, to be a gladiator was a pitiful existence. Most gladiators were either so poor that they didn't have another option, or they were slaves themselves. And that was a fine thing to do with your slaves too. If you wanted to send them to a gladiatorial school, so be it. They don't have a choice in the matter, and so they'll be forced to fight other people or fight against wild animals, probably to their death, and they don't have any say. How does that sound if we were to do that today? How many people would be willing to go for that idea today? Probably not so many, but that was pretty common at the time, and of course, that would be one thing, but this was a highly public spectacle. And so people would pay money to come to the Colosseum, which wasn't built until 72 or so AD, or the Circus Maximus was already there, the Hippodrome, or some of these other large arenas, and they would pay to watch people kill each other. And most of the time it was to the death. If it wasn't to the death, you might be able to spare your opponent so long as you have maimed them sufficiently to the point of incapacitation, where they can't fight back. And you might spare their life. But all this is done solely for entertainment. Again, mostly slaves fighting this way. This isn't just boxing. This isn't MMA. This is to the death. And so they would be killed quite often. Now, one particularly horrendous example comes during the reign of Caligula. Now, Caligula is top 5 worst Roman emperors, which isn't saying much because they were all terrible people. But he was particularly cruel and sadistic. And so the story goes, at least, and this is probably historically accurate, that on one occasion, whenever Rome was having a shortage of slaves, which basically means they hadn't expanded their empire in a while, hadn't brought in fresh slaves from somewhere else, he was watching a gladiatorial match, or in this case particularly, they were fighting against wild animals, and there weren't enough to suit his fancy. And so he, as the emperor, decides to have his soldiers take a section of the crowd and throw them to the wild animals. Is that okay today? Would that fly today? If the President of the United States said, we're just going to feed this part of Delaware to wild animals. And so we do have violence today, we have problems today, but some of the things that happened are particularly bad. Now, like I said, all of the emperors, pretty much all of the emperors were terrible people in one way or another. Some were better than others. And none of this is to say that there were no redeeming things that happened in Rome. If you've ever seen any Roman architecture, you know that there was a component of art to their civilization, even amongst the wicked things that happened. They did have a place for virtue and for philosophy, but by and large, they partook in all kinds of evils. And so did the emperors as well, which is why, if you total it up, depending on how you count them, about a third of Roman emperors were killed in office. Now, we've had a few presidents that have been assassinated, but generally when that happens, the assassin is not the next president. And yet, a lot of the times, whoever had the emperor killed would then take their place. And that's just how it went. And so that happened again quite often. Now, even if they weren't killed themselves, they would generally kill their heirs so that they wouldn't get killed by them first. They would kill their children, they would kill their nephews, their brothers, their cousins, whoever it may be that could take the throne, or whatever other political opponents might have stood in their way. And so that happened quite frequently. Another example of violence, and again, something that does happen today, but we see it all the way back here, is abortion. And it's actually not so different then than it is today, in the sense that their philosophy, at least Stoic philosophy, didn't view a fetus that's still growing as a child. And so the argumentation was the same as today. If the thing that's growing inside of someone is not a child, then it's not alive. And so it's not a question of human rights, it's just a question of what the parent wants to do with it. Well, that same philosophy is not anything new. It's been around for at least a couple thousand years. Abortion was legal, it was common across all social classes. Whether you were a slave, whether you were the elite of the elite, it was perfectly acceptable. And it was usually performed, if you're curious, it was usually a concoction of different herbs and chemicals that someone would drink, which would kill people a lot of the time too. But that was the method. And again, all that to say that it's always been, at least in some places, that has always existed, unfortunately, as it exists today. The other part of violence that we'll talk about is persecution. Now, for us as Christians, obviously that's the part that probably hits closest to home, or should. And so, under the Roman Empire, for the first 400 years of Christianity, Christians were persecuted mercilessly. Now, it wasn't constant. There were emperors that were kind of okay with it, and there were emperors that couldn't stand it. And so you have people like Nero, and you have people like Diocletian that end up committing almost genocide against Christians. And so we have many examples of this. Now, ironically, the rule in Rome, in the Roman Empire, was generally one of religious tolerance. And you could do whatever as long as it wasn't hurting someone else, unless the government didn't like what you were doing, or unless it posed some kind of threat. And Christianity did kind of just that. And I will say, it's not all that different from today, the reason that Christianity was being persecuted. Under the Roman Empire, as we said, religious tolerance was the rule, unless there's someone teaching that certain things are sinful, unless there are people who are willing to stand up and say, you know what, you can't do all of these things, all of these wicked things that we've just talked about. And if there's someone preaching against the evils that are happening, and they're preaching that there's only one God and not a multitude of gods, then the government steps in and says, oh, well, we're religiously tolerant so long as you're willing to tolerate all the evils and other religious practices that are going on. But if you're not willing to do that, then persecution will result. And so that is what happens, of course. And there are countless examples of persecution in the history of Christianity and Rome. And so we can look at a few ideas. Robbery, or just the taking of possessions, was quite common, as in it was okay to rob a Christian, to mug a Christian, to do whatever you want to with a Christian, and also to take their lands, to take their possessions, whatever you wanted to do. And this again depended on who was the emperor at the time. Christians were commonly imprisoned. We see that in the New Testament with Paul even, but they were commonly imprisoned. They were commonly stoned to death. They were commonly executed in many ways. Now, execution is not new to Rome. They didn't invent executing people, but they did kind of take it to an art form, almost, in the most morbid sense possible. And so they probably aren't the originators of the crucifixion, but it was one of their preferred methods of execution. And so we are quite familiar with that. As we already mentioned, in addition to gladiators being fed to wild beasts, Christians would eventually be fed to wild beasts as well. Now stop for a second and take that outside of history. How does that sound today? How many of you would be willing to be in this building tonight if it meant that tomorrow morning you might be fed to a lion in front of an audience of 10,000 people? It would change our perspective a little bit. They were burned alive quite frequently. Some were sacrificed on pagan altars just to add insult to injury. One example in particular is Catherine of Alexandria. She's considered a saint among some groups. She was wheeled to death. Now that's probably not something that we're familiar with, but essentially you would take a wagon wheel like we would think of, and you would crush someone's bones one by one. And usually you would start at the feet and you would work your way up. And I know that this is gruesome. And then after that you would be tied to it, and either you would be hung up to be crucified until you died, or you would be burned alive while tied to this wheel that you've been crushed with. The Romans loved, for some reason, they loved the punishment. They loved and had a sadistic attitude toward persecution. And they took it to levels that obviously it never should have come to. But that was the kind of society in which they lived. It wanted more and more violence, and it got more and more violence. And again, that goes back to Paul telling us that God gave them over to that debased mind. He said, okay, if you're going to do that, go ahead. But they took that and went off the deep end, as far as you can possibly go. There are over 1,000 names that we know specifically of martyrs. That doesn't mean there are 1,000 martyrs, that is people who died for the sake of Christianity. Those numbers are more likely in the hundreds of thousands, or possibly even in the millions. Now again, take that out of the history book for just a minute. Would you still be willing to be here tonight if tens of thousands of people were being killed across the country for doing the same thing that we're doing right now? Let's take a look at just a few ways that we can apply these things. The first way, of course, is that we do see some similarities. It would be hard to look at Roman culture and not see some of the same things that we experience today. But those similarities do run out. But what we do know is that history repeats itself, or it rhymes, however you want to say it. But it goes through cycles, morally speaking as well. There are low points where there is total wickedness, and then there's spiritual revivals, and then it sinks back down. And so in Roman times, in Roman culture, it was mostly at the very bottom. It was almost bottomed out as far as wickedness is concerned. About 400 AD, Christianity would become the religion of Rome. Well, that's kind of an uplifting point, although you would see centuries of infighting among the church and fighting with other countries as well from the church. And so it didn't get all that much better. But all that to say that we aren't the first society where abortion has been legal and rampant. We aren't the first society where homosexuality is legalized and where transgenderism is held up as something okay or even preferable. So we don't need to. It's tempting for us to look at our society and say, well, this must be the worst that it's ever been. And in reality, it's just not so. It may be getting closer to low points like this in history, but it's not the worst that it has ever been. How many of us are at risk of being fed to wild animals for what we believe? We're probably not to that point. I don't know that we will get to that point, just because there's a lot of barriers to cross there. But how many slaves do you know personally? I don't know any, and we probably aren't going to get back to the point of slavery. And so there are things that are bad now. There are things that have always been bad. And there are things that will probably be worse in time, but there are also things that were worse that have happened in history. So often with this, though, the question comes up, well, how long will God suffer with the evils that are going on right now? And that's a fair question. But usually, when people ask that, there's a notion that Christ will return because of the wickedness that's going on right now, and that God won't let it last, and that he will come back and he'll put a stop to it. And that's an idea, but God allowed Roman immorality to go on for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years at this level that we've been talking about tonight. And so, how far do you suppose that he'll let this nation go? How far do you suppose he'll let the nations of Europe go? But we really aren't addressing all of this yet, because one, when people take this notion that says, well, maybe God will come back or will send Christ back to stop all the violence and the wickedness that's happening right now. Well, maybe he will, but it's almost as if people act as though there's a verse in the Bible that tells us once the earth is wicked enough, Christ will come back. Well, instead we're told almost the opposite, that only God the Father knows the day that will take place. And so we don't know. It may be that we have 5 years left, or it may be that we have 5,000 years left. And we really have no way to tell when those things will take place. Besides that, when we take this viewpoint that says, well, our society is worse than it's ever been, or maybe than any society, well, that's a very inward focus there. It's a very self-centered approach. Are there not nations on the earth right now, as we speak, that are probably less moral than the United States of America? Is it possible that North Korea has a lower moral standard? Is it possible that Iran has a lower moral standard? I think you could make a pretty safe argument based on that. Now, the other thing we'll say, though, in connection with God returning or sending Christ back, well, he might, but he has an alternative that he's used over and over again in history, which is instead of intervening directly, he gives people over to a debased mind, and he watches as they crumble. It may be that God will return in the next 5 years, or it may be that we are experiencing a slow decline toward a culture like Rome, and that the society in which we live will decline as well, and that we're not building up to the judgment of the earth, but instead we're building downward, if that makes sense, toward our own destruction as a nation. That's a possibility. Now, I know that's very cheery thinking, but again, with all of this, the state of morality in Rome didn't get that way overnight. Or you could say Rome didn't become wicked in a day. And so the same thing is true for our society. It may be that we are trending toward that kind of society, but we aren't there quite yet. And again, we look to these pieces of history, and we look to the text in Romans chapter 1 here, and we say, well, things are bad, and we even see some similarities, but we aren't quite there yet. And so what do we do when we see ourselves in this position, though? And when we see more directly our society in this position? It would take another lesson to cover that, and so we won't cover that right now. But what we will do is we'll point out a little bit later on in the text of Romans, a passage that's well known and well loved in chapter 12. It says there in chapter 12 and verse 1, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. And so what do we do when we come to this? Well, we might recognize that we are on a path toward what Rome looked like. We may be, we may not be, depending on what happens in the future, depending on what kind of religious revival there may be. But we also want to make sure on an individual basis that we, individually, that our family, that our church, that our community doesn't go along with it. We might not be able to affect the whole of the nation, but we can have an effect, at least on the people that are around us. And so we keep ourselves holy. We don't conform to this world, and we renew our minds according to God's mind, not according to the things of the world. This lesson, again, has not been the cheeriest, but it does make the point, hopefully, that society may be bad now. It's always been bad. There's always been bad things that have gone on. But with that said, we have the individual responsibility, not to necessarily change the course of the nation, but to change the course of our own life and to change the course of those around us. This evening, you have an opportunity to respond within a wicked world, but with a righteous God, and to turn toward Him. And tonight, if you need to do that, tonight if you need to put on Christ in baptism, or tonight if you need to come back to Him, this is your opportunity. If you'll come as we stand, as we sing.